5 shots fired at Dutch investigative journalist.
Caught in the crosshairs of a narco war.
On the rainy evening of July 6th, 2021, the illusion of safety in one of Europe's most peaceful nations was shattered. Peter R. de Vries, the nation's most celebrated investigative journalist, walked out of a TV studio in the heart of Amsterdam. Moments after stepping onto the busy Amsterdam street, 5 shots rang out. He was hit 5 times, including a catastrophic wound to the head. For 9 days, the country held its breath and watched him fight for his life. But this was not just a murder, it was a declaration of war. For decades, the Netherlands was the global exemplar of liberal tolerance. It was a place where prisons were closing due to a lack of criminals and where deep societal conflicts were solved not with violence, but around a meeting table. But today, that image is cracking. In its place is a reality of severed heads left on sidewalks, torture chambers hidden in soundproofed shipping containers, and a state so infiltrated by organized crime that a report from the main Dutch Police Association explicitly warned that the Netherlands was starting to resemble a narco state. How did one of Europe's safest, most prosperous countries become the primary logistics hub for the global cocaine trade? With afterthought. It is easy to look at the headlines and assume the Netherlands has become a lawless wasteland. But before we diagnose the disease, we must understand the patient, and that requires correcting a major misconception. The Netherlands is not a failed state. Far from it. It remains one of the richest countries on earth. It has a GDP per capita of over $60,000, a life expectancy of 82 years, and it is consistently ranked among the best places in the world to be a child. But ironically, it is this very wealth, this hyper-efficiency, that made it the perfect host for a parasite. The Dutch did not become a target because they were weak. They became one because they were productive. To understand how this transformation happened, we have to look back at the golden age of the 20th century. The modern Netherlands was built on a unique political philosophy known as the Polder Model, originating from the medieval necessity of water management, where everyone, regardless of status, had to cooperate to keep the dikes from breaking. The Polder Model evolved into a system of consensus. It prioritized pragmatism over ideology. It fostered a society where the goal was always social peace and the method was always compromise. This philosophy gave birth to a policy known as tolerance. The idea was simple. Prohibiting certain vices like soft drugs or prostitution creates more social harm than regulating them. So the state decided to look the other way. They allowed the front door of the coffee shops to sell cannabis, even though the back door, the wholesale supply, remained illegal. It was a uniquely Dutch solution. With afterthought, we can see that this policy of looking the other way had a catastrophic side effect. It desensitized the entire legal system to the mechanics of the drug trade. For decades, police and prosecutors were culturally conditioned to view drug offenses as administrative nuisances rather than serious crimes. They focused on harm reduction for users while ignoring the harm production of traffickers. While the state was looking the other way, the economy was undergoing a massive shift that would open the floodgates. In 1959, the massive Groningen gas field was discovered. It was one of the largest in the world. The resulting revenue funded an expansive welfare state, but it also led to what economists call Dutch disease, a decline in the manufacturing sector as the currency appreciated. As factories closed, the Netherlands pivoted aggressively toward logistics. They cemented the port of Rotterdam as the gateway to Europe. Today, the port moves 14 million shipping containers a year. It is an engineering marvel designed for one thing: speed. A container sits on the dock for the shortest time possible to maximize throughput. But speed is the enemy of security. When you move millions of containers, physical inspection of every single one is impossible. For the criminal networks that were beginning to form in the shadows, Rotterdam was not just a port. It was an open door to a market of 500 million European consumers. But who opened that door? This brings us to the most sensitive and critical part of the story, the Trojan horse of the 1960s migration policies. During the industrial boom, the Netherlands faced a labor shortage. In 1969, the government signed a recruitment treaty with Morocco, but they did not recruit from just anywhere. The recruitment was heavily concentrated in the Rif region of northern Morocco. The Rif is not like the rest of Morocco. It is a region with a distinct history of rebellion, isolation, and deep distrust of the central government. In 1958, just a decade before these men arrived, the Rif had risen in revolt against the Moroccan king. The uprising was brutally crushed, including aerial bombardment of civilians. When these young men arrived in the Netherlands, they carried generational trauma and a deep-seated suspicion of state authority. And then the economic trap snapped shut. The guest worker program was based on the assumption that these men would eventually go home. They did not. Family reunification laws in the 1970s turned temporary workers into permanent residents. Tragically, this permanency coincided with the collapse of the heavy industries that had employed them. By the 1980s, mass unemployment plagued the first generation of Moroccan immigrants. The Dutch state's response was well-intentioned but disastrous. Instead of retraining these workers, the state used the disability benefit system as a tool of mass pacification. They placed thousands of able-bodied men on generous benefits to keep unemployment figures low. This created a lost generation. Fathers were permanently at home, stripped of their traditional status as providers, humiliated by a system that no longer needed them. Their children, the second generation, grew up in neighborhoods characterized by worklessness and social exclusion. And to make matters worse, the Dutch government applied a policy called pillarization. Historically, Dutch society was divided into pillars: Catholic, Protestant, Socialist, each with their own schools and clubs. The state tried to replicate this for the new migrants, funding separate Islamic schools and community centers, supporting separate institutions. They thought they were fostering multiculturalism. In reality, they were subsidizing segregation. They allowed the Rifian community to operate autonomously, effectively creating a state within a state in neighborhoods like Amsterdam West. It was in this vacuum between a tolerant police force and a marginalized, insulated community that the Morco Maffia was born. Initially, they traded in hashish, exploiting their family connections back in the Rif region, a major cannabis producer. But as the global drug market shifted, they realized that the logistics network they had built for cannabis could carry something far more profitable: cocaine. Buying a kilo in South America for 4,000 euros and selling it in Europe for 50,000 euros created an arms race. The criminal networks professionalized. They did not just use the port of Rotterdam, they infiltrated it. They developed the switch method. Corrupt insiders at the terminals move a container filled with drugs to a location where a clean container is waiting. The contents are swapped, or the drugs are removed entirely by teams of young men known as outhalers. These outhalers, retrievers, are often recruited from those same vulnerable neighborhoods where the state had failed to integrate the youth. They view a prison sentence not as a deterrent, but as a badge of honor, and the payment for a night's work can be thousands of euros. The sheer volume of money involved allowed for corruption at a scale previously unknown in Northern Europe. Customs officers, planners, and crane operators were offered plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or face the consequences. In 2023, Dutch customs seized nearly 60,000 kilograms of cocaine nationwide, with the vast majority tied to the ports led by Rotterdam. But experts warn that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The illicit economy generated by this trade is estimated at billions of euros, money that has to go somewhere. And this is where the narco state label becomes terrifyingly real. Dutch criminologists call it undermining. It describes the process by which organized crime infiltrates the legitimate upper world. Drug lords do not keep billions in cash under a mattress. They buy luxury real estate. They invest in hospitality, they hire top-tier lawyers. Investigations have revealed that some legal professionals were not just defending clients but acting as couriers and facilitators for the gangs. When a drug lord owns the local cafe, the boxing gym and the rental apartments, they effectively become the local government. They replace the rule of law with the rule of fear. And with that fear came a level of violence that shattered the Dutch self-image. The Morco War, a feud between rival factions, spilled into the public sphere. It was not just about business, it was about reputation. In 2016, the severed head of Nabil Amzieb was found on a sidewalk in Amsterdam facing a shisha lounge. It was a medieval warning designed to shock. But the horror did not stop there. In 2020, police hacked an encrypted communication network called Encro Chat. The messages led them to a raid in a quiet rural village called Wouwse Plantage. There, hidden inside a warehouse, they found shipping containers that had been converted into soundproofed cells. One was set up as a dentist's room, complete with a dental chair, restraints, pliers, scalpels, and handcuffs bolted to the floor. The messages revealed the intent: treatment of rivals and defaulters. This was the Mexicanization of the Dutch underworld. The torture chambers proved that the gangs had become a power capable of challenging the state's monopoly on violence. And when the state finally tried to fight back, the gangs escalated. The Marengo trial, centered on the alleged mastermind Ridwan Taghi, became the focal point of this war. The trial had to be held in a heavily fortified court in Amsterdam, but the walls of the court could not protect the people outside. When Nabil B became a crown witness, the gangs systematically dismantled his support network. They murdered his brother Redouan, they murdered his lawyer Dirk Wiersum, shooting him in front of his wife in a quiet suburb, and finally they murdered Peter R. de Vries. They targeted the family, the legal defense and the free press. This violence has even become an export product. Across the border in Germany, a wave of ATM explosions has terrorized small towns. In 2021 alone, there were nearly 400 such attacks. The perpetrators were predominantly Dutch gangs. Using the explosives expertise and high-speed logistics they developed in the drug trade, they strike in the middle of the night, risking the collapse of residential buildings where the ATM units are housed, and then speed back across the border in Audi RS getaway cars. It illustrates perfectly how the tolerance trap in the Netherlands has created security externalities for the entire EU. The Dutch public watched this happen for years. They watched as the Polder Model of consensus failed to stop men with Kalashnikovs. They watched as the tea-drinking approach of community policing was met with brutal indifference by the gangs. And in 2023, something snapped. For decades, linking crime to immigration was a political taboo in the Netherlands. The establishment parties and the media enforced a strict code of silence, labeling any criticism of multiculturalism as intolerant. But the reality on the streets made that silence impossible to maintain. The murder of Pim Fortuyn in 2002 had cracked the taboo, but the events from 2021 to 2023 shattered it completely. The election of Geert Wilders and his Party for Freedom in November 2023 was a political earthquake. Securing 37 seats, it was a stunning victory for a man who had lived under police protection for years due to death threats. This was not just a vote about migration numbers, it was a scream of frustration. It was a vote against the breakdown of order. The Dutch voter, witnessing the drug wars, the corruption, and the impunity of the Morco Maffia, rejected the traditional parties. The sentiment was clear, the social contract was broken. The state could no longer protect its citizens. Today, the Netherlands is trying to reverse course. The era of gedogen is effectively over. The government is militarizing the police, involving the army in guarding courthouses, and deploying special intervention squads. They are proposing the strictest asylum policies in Dutch history, with talk of opting out of EU migration pacts. The romantic image of bicycle riding, pot smoking, tolerant Dutch society is being replaced by a surveillance state fighting a low-intensity drug war. But the question remains, is it too late? The criminal networks have effectively franchised the drug trade. They are agile transnational corporations that adapt faster than national bureaucracies can react. When seizures go up in Rotterdam, they move to Vlissingen or Antwerp or Southern Europe. And the social wounds among the lost generation in the RIF communities, the undermining of local government, the loss of trust in the state cannot be fixed with a police raid. The Netherlands wanted to be the moral superpower of the world. A beacon of open borders and open minds. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. It proved that tolerance without boundaries is a trap. And as the flowers laid for Peter R. de Vries withered, they left behind a question that every liberal democracy must now answer. Can a tolerant society survive intolerance? And can the Polder Model survive the Kalashnikov?